Welcome viewers. In this edition of Geo Interview, we have Professor Adnan Naseemullah, who is currently a senior lecturer in international relations at King's College London. He had previously taught at Hopkins University and the London School of Economics. His research interests include the political economy of industrial development, state formation, political order, populism, and comparative national development in relation to the Indian subcontinent. He has written two books. First is Development After Statism, and the second, Patchworks States, the Historical Roots of the Subnational Conflict. He also serves as a Research Ethics Committee Chair and Research Integrity Advisor for the School of Security Studies. Today, our discussion will be broadly based on his second book, The Patchworks States, the Historical Roots of Subnational Conflict, which talks about the perils and the problems of our colonial legacy. We welcome you, Professor. So, Professor,
thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Professor, being a professor of King's College London, why did you particularly choose this subject of South Asian studies? So, do you think European academia is doing enough in the domain of South Asian studies, given the rising geopolitical importance?
It's a good question. I mean, I've always been working on South Asian politics since my doctorate. Many of those sort of most important questions of politics and political economy are driven by sort of dynamics in the South Asian region, including the dynamics of internal political violence, which is sort of the subject of the second book, but also notions of comparative industrial development. So not only is South Asia sort of a key region, it can also tell the rest of the world sort of key lessons about these sort of dynamics that are broader than just South Asia. And so I think that it is true that South Asia is sort of comparatively understudied, at least in the kind of European and North American academies. And so what I and my colleagues and friends are really trying to do is to make sort of South Asia more legible, but also to emphasize the sort of lessons that South Asia can provide for sort of international politics.
Great. So, Professor, my next question is, what are your thoughts behind the phrasing of the title, The Patchwork States? What have you intended to convey with that?
So one of the things, and so I'll tell you a little bit of a sort of a background of the book. It started in 2008 when I was doing fieldwork in Pakistan, in Lahore, among sort of the industrial sort of districts and textile mills of sort of central Punjab. But this was at the moment in which the sort of neo-Taliban, or the Tehreek Taliban insurgency was sort of erupting in 2008. And you may not remember this, but once upon a time, there was a US president called George W. Bush. And he sort of likened the tribal areas, or the federally administered tribal areas, tribal agencies of Northwest Pakistan, like the Wild West of America. And that really sort of gave me sort of a sort of question about what it means to have areas of the country that are, quote, wild, unquote. What does it mean in terms of the relationship between state and society in different parts of not just Pakistan, but also India, and to some extent even in Bangladesh. So what really this is about is to thinking about what the historical roots of differences in the ways the state functions and what the state looks like in, for example, in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, the sort of red belt of Maoist conflict in India, versus Gujarat, versus Mumbai and Delhi, as well as places like Kashmir. And of course, in Pakistan, you have Baluchistan, Northwest Frontier, what used to be the Northwest Frontier province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which includes these tribal agencies that were only really integrated in 2018. You have Sindh, you have Baluchistan, Punjab. So obviously, these are all federal units, but within those federal units are very, very different sort of notions of what governance looks like and how people look at the state and how the state looks at people in different areas. So what I was really interested in is looking at, are there histories that help us in a sort of integrated manner explain those differentiations? And then secondly, are those differentiations in governance helpful for us to understand some of the key points of geographical variation in outcomes of political interests? So things like patterns of political violence, electoral coordination, electoral representation, and development. So that's essentially the book, is that Patchwork States came from the idea that these states were built from a patchwork of different forms of political authority that were established during colonial rule and that were changed and revised, but still the sort of essence of that patchwork remains.
Indeed, a great idea behind that, Professor. So, Professor, my next question is, like in your book, you have mentioned that South Asian countries face multidimensional challenges to civic peace and stability from politically motivated actors. So, Professor, who are these actors and what role do they play?
So I'll just give you just an array of different sort of stories or different actors that we're talking about. The first and foremost to mention is one of those major sort of areas are of insurgent actors in South Asia. And probably the most sort of well-known and famous sort of civil war cases in South Asia are Nepal and Sri Lanka. So normally we talk about these. But in both India and Pakistan, and to some extent even in Bangladesh, you have insurgent actors. So insurgent groups like the ones in India in the Northeast, the sort of different territorial separatist actors. Then you have the sort of Maoist groups, what used to be sort of a variety of different left-wing guerrilla movements, but sort of mobilized into the Communist Party of India Maoist. You have the different sort of insurgent groups that are based in Kashmir and others. In Pakistan, for a long time, it was the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan that has been fragmented. Now we see more of the Islamic State sort of being more active. But so that's sort of, we all see these people as being groups that are challenging the authority and sovereignty of the state. But at the same time, there are lots of other political actors that use violence to accomplish ends. So these might be political parties, right? There's a huge amount of electoral violence that happens in South Asia around elections between different political parties, party cadres who scuffle with one another, clash with one another, and then eventually, especially in Bangladesh, engage in really serious violence. There are also communitarian groups. So you can imagine the sort of the VHP being engaged with riots in Gujarat in 2002. You have different sort of sects in Pakistan. You have the Tehrik-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which is a sort of a political party, but is also quite violent against sort of quotidian police forces in major cities over issues of blasphemy. So there's a sort of an array and a variety of different actors who are acting to either challenge the state fundamentally, right, to bring out proletarian revolution or to create separatism. And that goes back all the way to sort of independence of these countries, or to sort of engage in more quotidian action within the state. South Asia is a very violent place, but it's violent in very, very different ways.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
So Professor, my next question is like, as for me, like you have focused on three nations, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, in exemplifying the main theme of your. So like, would you like to share the rationale behind that? Like, why did you choose these three countries?
I mean, these are the very obvious answer is that these are the three countries that I know the best. But I think that one of the things that's interesting is that all of them were under the same kind of broad government or kind of universe of governance under colonial rule, right? So that Pakistan was partitioned, Pakistan, East and West Pakistan were partitioned from India, and then Bangladesh was partitioned from Pakistan. But before 1947, you would travel from the northwest frontier, the federally administered tribal areas, way to the sort of, and actually for a while, Burma, what is now Myanmar, was included in that, but then it was sort of separated out as a sort of a different sort of colonial unit. We're all one complex geography of governance under the British Indian authorities. And so when these three countries separate, they're separating from a kind of a cohesive patchwork that's internally complex, but it is one sort of unit in under colonial rule. And so we can see sort of common themes in all of them, right? They're all being sort of the relationship between the eventually the viceregal government and the princely states, as well as the areas under their direct administration, were all under the same hierarchies. Whereas that is not true in quite the same way with Sri Lanka or Ceylon, which was a crown colony. Nepal fairly early becomes a sort of kind of an independent sovereign suzerain kingdom under the British, but sort of has a slightly different sort of place within the kind of constellation of who's in charge. So India and Pakistan and Bangladesh are comparable because they were all under the same sort of systems of governance that were, as I said, very internally complex, but weren't different from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India before 1947. Before, say, the 1920s, those names wouldn't even make any sense. So does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yes, Professor. Yeah. So Professor, like my next question is, you have majorly focused on a diverse set of government arrangements that dated during the colonial times. Okay. So, and you have termed those things like as driven by fear, greed, and frugality, and which have played a very important role in determining the historical roots of today's patchwork states. So, like, do you want to throw some light on that?
So, part of what I wanted to do was to explain the sort of historical roots of differentiated or diverse governance within sort of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in the contemporary era. And that sort of took me back to the colonial rule, because the state was really built, the modern state, right? There were previous states. There was this sort of Mughal Empire and other sort of forms, the Vijayanagar Empire in South India. Sort of, there were previous forms of kind of governance, but this notion of a kind of a modern bureaucratic state is kind of an artifact of the 19th century almost anywhere in the world, including the West. So that places it in this sort of time of British conquest across India. And so what I was interested in is thinking about how the British, but specifically the East India Company, which is slightly different from the British state, how did they conquer India? Right. This is a story that has been told by many, many other people, but I wanted to take a particular angle of it. Was why did they conquer India in different ways in different places? Right. India itself was the British authority spread from Bengal to the rest of the country over the course of the late 18th and early 19th century. So what I was looking at was just locally, why were they governed in slightly different ways in different places? And that comes down to this idea of colonial motivations. Now, usually when people talk about the motivations behind colonial rule, it's very simple. It's just extraction. We want to extract resources from India and send them back to Britain. And I think that if you take a kind of a high elevation perspective, like a bird's eye view, then that is indeed what is happening. But the actual practice of what's going on during this period is that British authorities at the local level, the provincial level, are responding to particular opportunities and constraints, right? And so this comes down to this question of greed and fear. Greed is very much about taxation and trade, right? But then fear is about challenging the challenges from other European companies, but also powerful Indian polities like the Maratha Confederacy, Mysore, eventually the Sikh Empire. And that these different sort of motivations, along with what frugality is very important, because the essence of both the East India Company and the British state in relation to colonial rule in India is not to spend any money, right? And for everything to be based on costs and benefits, because that's not usually the way that people think about state building. They think about state building as a kind of an all or nothing enterprise, whereas the British were very, very concerned, very sort of obsessed with not spending money. And of course, they created huge debts, but those are debts that India took on. So this government of India that they created. So if you like, greed, fear, and frugality stand in for the various motivations of these different actors in different periods, which is one of the reasons why we get very different types of governance, and why certain areas are integrated as districts rather than or remain as princely states, why you have different forms of land tenure sort of established in different places. And the book sort of the chapter 3 of the book goes into sort of the dynamics of the creation of this variation in different places, basically using this kind of rubric of greed, fear, and frugality.
And Professor, in continuation with that, like, how have these played a role in formation of today's patchwork states? How colonial times have led to the formation of today's patchwork states? And what all differences can you see in the new system and the old system?
Well, so the book in chapter 5 talks about how independence in India and Pakistan and eventually Bangladesh are really trying to grapple with the legacies of new countries that are built on foundations that are not very well integrated. So there's a lot of politics around how those things change, but the idea is that there are still legacies of differentiation because state and society relate to one another in a particular way. And you can change those relationships, but usually it costs a lot of time, resources, money, blood, and treasure to do that. And that has happened in some places and it hasn't happened in other places. So essentially, as we move from sort of in chapter 3 story, which is the establishment of this variation, to the chapter 5 story, which is the sort of a kind of coalescing of these different, these sort of local variations, district level variations into a sort of a slightly more contracted but still present variation. That's the story of essentially the second critical juncture. The major second critical juncture is the independent statehood, and then how independent statehood over time shifts some things, doesn't shift others. But that's the reason why these countries are still patchwork states, even though state builders at the post-colonial state builders are trying to sort of redress these legacies.
So Professor, my next question is, in your book, you have dealt with various questions like the reason behind distinct patterns of conflict which occur within the same national conflict, or the relationship between the state, authority of the state, citizens, and the conflicts. So how do you perceive all of this, and are there any systematic solutions to this, or are we destined to continuously face these problems? What do you think, Professor?
That's a very good question. So let me actually just address it in stuff that's not in my book, so that at least you get sort of value added other than just hearing the account, sort of what I'm doing with the sort of different sources of the book. I mean, I think that especially in terms of violence, it's about understanding that India, especially, but this is also true of Pakistan and Bangladesh in its own way. Bangladesh is a different story that we can sort of get into because it's much more homogenous, right? It was partitioned out of one half of the United Province of Bengal, and so as a result, it's much more homogenous in terms of its governance traditions. Rather than Pakistan, which was made up of 4 or 5 provinces that were very, very different. Baluchistan and the Northwest Frontier are quite different from Sindh and Punjab, and Karachi itself has this sort of metropolitan governance. It's very different. And as we know, India looks very different if you're in Rajasthan or if you're in Orissa or Oreya, or in the Himalayan states, or in the center of the country, or in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, for example. So I mean, I think in some senses it's sort of to reflect that there is a lot of variation in the way the state relates to society. That might change because we've got new technologies and things like that. There is a sort of a nationalization of politics in India that has basically been sort of pushing forward in many, many different ways by the current government. So I would say that there is no one solution, because this is about how the state engages with society and their own specific problems in different places. But at the same time, the logic of politics is that governments come in and then they govern at the union level for the entire country. So there's always a little bit of a disconnect. And as a scholar, I think that you just have to say, well, really what we need to do is to understand the specifics of each ones of these conflicts to come up with solutions that are pragmatic and local rather than imposing one view on everything. But in some senses, this is more a book that tries to give you a different perspective of how the Indian state works than what the Indian state should do, if that makes sense. I mean, that's a little bit unsatisfying, especially if you're young students and you want to change the world. And I'm an old person, and I just spend all of my time sort of staring into the abyss of what has occurred. But that's essentially, it is a sort of a plea for understanding the roots of the why the state looks different in different places.
So, Professor, my next question is, in the recent past, I've seen that there has been a political turmoil in Afghanistan or Pakistan and India. So, Professor, what do you think will bring up a change in this mechanism of patchwork states?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, I think that there are sort of dynamics of nationalization, and then there are dynamics of recognition of difference. And those two have always kind of been in tension in Indian and Pakistani politics. Bangladesh is a little bit more complicated, which we can get into if you're interested. But this was sort of formalized by Anatol Lieven in a book called Pakistan, a Hard Country, by sort of the dynamics of centripetal versus centrifugal forces in politics, right? So the idea of the centralizing, and we understand certain leaders are centralizers, right? You know, Narendra Modi is a centralizer, Indira Gandhi was a centralizer, Imran Khan as a centralizer. At the same time, and then of course there are sort of bureaucratic apparatuses too, right? The Indian Administrative Service, the military. These are sort of forces that sort of centralize Indian Pakistani society, Pakistani military, that kind of thing. But then at the same time, you have these what Anatol Lieven calls the centrifugal forces, the forces that are decentralizing, that are trying to emphasize these sort of differences. And so in some senses, I understand your need to think about like, how do we solve this problem? But it's more like using patchwork states as a lens to understand politics that centralizes and doesn't centralize, if that makes sense.
Professor, do you think that as a rising democracy, India lacks a rigorous approach towards doing comparative analysis?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a rich tradition. It's a tradition that I would like to see coming from both India and from other places. Like I'm talking to you from London, places like the United States, other countries. There's a long tradition of sort of scholarship and exchange between Indian scholars and sort of Western scholars and other scholars. The one thing that I think is missing is the conversation within South Asia between, say, scholars of politics in Pakistan and scholars of politics in India, and students who can actually talk across boundaries. And one of the benefits is that sharing languages, especially between in terms of Bengali between Bangladesh and East Bengal, and Urdu and Hindi, and sort of shares language, shares culture, and I think that the study of the comparative politics of South Asia, rather than just focusing on India in comparative perspective, sort of emphasizes the exceptional aspects of India, which exist, and any country can be exceptional and non-exceptional. But the point of comparative politics is to think about are there certain variables, are there certain sort of key concepts that might not be the same in every country, but help us understand what is similar and what is different. And the book has a lot of sort of more minor and tentative reflections about India and Pakistan, especially, and Bangladesh as countries, coming from the subnational perspective. So even though the book is spending most of its time talking about these sort of subnational outcomes, right? So at the district level, different patterns of violence, different forms of representation, it does sort of reflect on how we think about India and Pakistan and Bangladesh as whole countries. And the implicit argument, to make explicit, is to say that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are not nearly as different as you think.
So, Professor, this is my last question. This is something personal. So, as a professor of King's College London, so how was your overall experience there? And would you like to suggest something to the viewers who are willing to pursue the same field?
So, I mean, I'm in a very interesting sort of unit within King's College London. King's College is sort of a huge university in London. We have several, the London School of Economics, the University College London, the School of Oriental and African Affairs, Royal Holloway, Queen Mary. We have a sort of a constellation of different, very large universities in London. So London is a great place to come to study if you want to sort of, for example, do master's work and things like that. And it's very international. So not to sort of talk about as an advertisement about studying in England and studying in London. I happen to be situated in the Department of War Studies in King's College London, which is a really interesting and fairly unique kind of collaboration among historians and sociologists and anthropologists, as well as international relations scholars. And I sort of sit somewhere in between all of these, which means that you can get sort of perspectives that are much more multidisciplinary, but come from a sort of military IR conflict sort of perspective or background. So that's been, and I have to say that in absolute all honesty, I have learned so much. This book wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been teaching my students. Many of them coming from Indian universities, some of them actually coming from the Indian administrative service and the Indian police service. Over the course of several years, I was able to hone a lot of these arguments in terms of the conversations I've had with my students. So that's been a true pleasure.
It's great. It's great knowing all about this. So thank you so much, Professor. It was indeed great talking to you and knowing about the Patchwork States under which we are currently living. We feel honored to host you, Professor. Have a great day, Professor.
Thank you very much.